Welcome to The Chemical Show, the podcast where chemical means business. I'm your host, Victoria Meyer, bringing you stories and insights from leaders driving innovation and growth across the chemical industry. Each week, we explore key trends, real-world challenges, and the strategies that make an impact. Let's get started. Welcome back to The Chemical Show, where leaders talk business. Today, I've got a special guest, and as some of my friends call him, the OG, The Chemical Show guest number one, Mr. Brad Beauchamp, who is the president and CEO of Carpenter Company, which is the world's largest producer of comfort cushioning products. Basically, the things you're sitting on, sleeping on, etc. Brad was last on the podcast in 2022, and at that time, he revealed we just talked about the cybersecurity attack that they had survived. So we've got a whole lot of other things going on. Today, we're going to be talking about a number of things, including some of the acquisitions that they've made recently and how those are turning out, and a few other topics. And Brad doesn't know this, but I'm really hoping he's going to make an announcement. No pressure, Brad, because I'm feeling a little bit of FOMO right now, because as we record this, Taylor Swift was just on the Kelsey Brothers podcast, New Heights, and she announced her new album. So I don't know if Brad's got something big and bold for us today, but we're going to find out. Brad, welcome back to The Chemical Show.
Oh, that's quite the introduction. So I don't know how. I think it's only downhill from here on this. So we'll see where it goes. But I am
those of us who know you know that you're better than Travis, Kelsey, and Taylor Swift. So we can make this happen.
Yeah, he's got much better hair than I do, and probably a much bigger bank account. But other than that, I got him beat. So
Perfect.
we'll just go from there. But it's a pleasure to be back on. We were just talking before we started recording how great I think that this is for the industry overall, and the more people that listen to it, I get a lot of feedback from people that say they've heard me or they've heard others, and they grab things out of it. And I just really, I'm glad that you started this a few years back, and that obviously honored to be on again, which happy to answer whatever questions are on your mind.
Yeah.
So
I love it. Well, thank you. I appreciate you being here. And I think actually one of the interesting things, I'm just going to throw in this a little bit of a plug. What's interesting and what I did not anticipate when I started the Chemical Show was this aspect of kind of just the longevity and the visibility of it. And we actually did some work where guests that are on the Chemical Show, like on the podcast, end up in numbers. The average Google search rank is number 7. So think about it as being above the fold. And of course, Google owns YouTube. Everything gets published out to YouTube. So when people are on the Chemical Show, they show up on YouTube, they show up on Google, they show up around everywhere, which is really great. The other interesting thing, Brad, and I don't know if you've had this experience, but people have told me, and guests on the podcast have told me, that they use these podcast interviews as preparation for their interviews with a company, as they're doing research on an executive or research on a company. They're like, I'm talking to that executive later this week. I wanted to hear from their own words what they want to say. And I never expected that. I think it's just a really cool way of people getting access to people and to companies and to insights.
yeah, I've had it a couple of times where people, I don't know if the term's right, have name dropped it, right? Have said, oh, before they met me or something, or we sit down, they said, oh, I happened to catch your podcast that you did with the Chemical Show, right? So yeah, definitely people are using it as kind of a background to kind of research their subjects. So I think that's great as well.
Cool stuff. So let's turn this over to you a little bit, Brad, because although you're the OG, everybody may not really know who you are. So just give me a brief introduction to you and to how you got to what you're doing and to Carpenter.
Sure. I mean, I think that, and one of the interesting things when you ask the people the questions is I'm always interested in what you call it their origin story, right? How they got to where they are. And when you look back on it, you're like, boy, it's, the Grateful Dead, a long, strange trip it's been, right? When I got out of high school in the 80s, right, and going to college in the Midwest, so I'm from Chicago originally, I studied biology and chemistry because I was interested in those subjects. And I was also interested in art and figured you couldn't make any money in art, so might as well stick to the sciences. And then when I graduated, I was like, okay, what are you going to do with that? And naive me at the time was like, well, I really can't see myself working in R&D, so maybe I'll go into sales. And so I kind of applied to pharmaceutical and chemical companies and in Chicago, and this will reflect how old I am. There was no internet searches, right? You went to the library and you got a book, a list of companies by sector, and you sent out resumes to everywhere, and several of them came back, and like people like Ecolab and Nalco and things like that were in Chicago, and I happened to sign on with Stepan at the time. So in 1989, I started my venture into the surfactants and general chemical space, moving into polymers and everything else, and then did that for them in a variety of regions. Got an MBA, moved back to Chicago. So I was in Texas for a while, moved back to Chicago, ran a couple of businesses for them, and then left them to come to Carpenter to run the chemical business at the end of 2008. And I think you and I first really met each other in 2009 or 2010
Yeah.
when you were with Clariant at the time. And then, ran the chemical business at Carpenter for 10 years. And then Mr. Pauly, who was the owner of the company, asked me to become the president. I became president in 2018. He passed away in 2020. The board said, you're the president, chief operating officer, you should be the CEO. So I've really been the CEO since 2020. So when I kind of take a step back and think about that, it's almost 5 years as CEO, which seems like 5 minutes, right?
That's
Some
actually a
days
long time for a CEO as well. Not necessarily for privately held companies, but for many companies. 5 years is a long tenure.
so was reading an article, I think it was in the Harvard Business Review, but it might have been in another place that the public CEO average lifetime is 3.1 years. They didn't see anything about private, but it's definitely a results oriented kind of job when you're at it, and you need to kind of deliver results, and sometimes circumstances help with that and sometimes they hurt with that, right? And if you had, like when I signed on in 2020, it was obviously some crazy stuff with COVID, and we talked about, you mentioned earlier, the cyber stuff, but we also had some good business conditions in 21 and 22, and then we're dealing with other business conditions since then. And it's a crazy time, and I'm thankful for the 5 years that I have and that I've had, and look forward to more years and doing more things. So
Yeah. Yeah. And it has been crazy business conditions really for the last 3 years. I mean, really, the entirety of the 2020s has been a little bit crazy from a supply chain perspective, just a business ups and downs perspective. Now we're facing tariffs, have been facing tariffs, I guess, for the last year. It's not been normal, but I guess nothing is ever really normal, Brad. But during this time, you guys made some big moves. So it's interesting because you talk about as a CEO that it's really about the results, and it absolutely is. And yet it's also about vision and where you can lead your company. And so since you've been CEO, I know that you guys have done several big acquisitions, the Recticel acquisition, which really grew the company significantly, right? And I think you would say that's like the first time you guys took on that big of an acquisition and took on debt. The Casper mattresses, which some people are probably sleeping on today, so I want to hear more about that. And then NCFI Polyurethanes. So tell us a little bit about this approach to acquisitions, what prompted it, because again, this is different than Carpenter of the old. And how are you bringing them into the fold and creating results out of that?
yeah, that's we probably could go on for a couple hours about this, but I'll try and keep my answers informative and somewhat brief on it. So I would say that when I became CEO, Mr. Pauly had been with the company for 65 years. Most people wouldn't appreciate that. Most people wouldn't think of somebody working at a company for 65 years. And so if you do the math, yes, he was in his early 90s and still came in every day, right? And very influential, dynamic leader throughout the industry, but let alone at Carpenter. And so he passes away, and the board looks to me and says, "Okay, what's your plan for the business, right? And it's yours now. What are you going to do on it?" And you have choices. You could say, "Well, this is a successful business. we'll just ride it out the way it is. That's really not my nature, is to say let's coast on things. I'm kind of a when I go on vacation, my wife likes to lay by the pool, and I like to go do things, right? So I'm one of those where I'm like, okay, how can we be improving? How can we be getting better? And so what I sat down with the board and said there are opportunities for us to grow our business. We had a good footprint in Europe, but we weren't the dominant player in Europe. So I'm like, there's opportunities in Europe. There's opportunities in the United States in segments that aren't furniture and bedding. There's growth in automotive that's happening in the EV space. There's acoustics, sound attenuation, as we call it, aspects of polyurethanes. And they're not giant categories, but they're growing significantly, right? And they're opportunities. And so we said, look, these are opportunities for us to grow the business. And at the time, it was interesting because in 2018, I want to think it was, there was a company called Foam Partner. And I went to Mr. Pauly and I said, we should buy Foam Partner. And our European colleagues, mine, were on board with that. They think Foam Partner is great. It gets into a lot of these spaces that we're involved in. Mr. Pauly was really obsessed with the geography and said, look, they're mostly European. It doesn't really fit. So we took a pass on it, and Recticel bought them. And then we can go through a whole lengthy thing of how that didn't work. But what ended up happening is right after they had bought them, not a year into it, they got a hostile takeover offer from Griner, which is another foamer who had been partners with Recticel in a joint venture in Eastern Europe. That's a whole different, like I said, a whole nother hour-long podcast on the details with that. But needless to say, Recticel didn't want to be hostily took over, so they reached out to the industry, they reached out to us, and they said, would you be interested in being the white knight in this situation? So, the foam partner business was already interesting to me. Recticel was kind of combining their technical foam and comfort business with foam partners. The board said, is this something you're interested in? We kind of looked at it we kind of have four ways we consider growing, right? How do we continue to expand the chemical business? How do we diversify flexible foam? How do we get some market diversification into the right markets for us, right, geographically? And then how do we look at sustainability as part of a strong business case? And so when we looked at the Recticel side of it, it ticked all four of those boxes. So it was easy for our board to say, I understand with Brad, with what you're saying, Carpenter's strategy is that Recticel fits within that. And so they said, go for it, right? And that was in April of 2020, and we know what was happening in March, April of 2020. It was COVID. So I like to say I was one of the few people flying back and forth to Europe during COVID. I think when I look back on it, I had 18 different COVID tests within the year because you had to get tested on the way there, the way back, while you're there. Passed every single one of them, by the way, thankfully.
Good deal.
But
That's amazing.
Really a crazy time to kind of buy a public company in Europe. Well, actually, we didn't buy the whole thing. We were going to buy the whole thing, and we kind of took a pass on insulation, and they kept that. And we bought, what was 2/3 of their business. So we, kind of took a publicly traded company in Brussels and put them into a Carpenter private company, which some people on the podcast might not know. We're a private company. We're celebrating our 75th anniversary this year, so a little bit of
Congratulations.
details
That's a
about
big
us.
deal
Yeah.
too. 75 years, right?
Yeah.
It's
So
huge.
we saw why it would strategically fit in those regards. That made a lot of sense for us, right? To go for it, make it happen. We did that. In the process of that, then we were looking at so the Recticel foam partner business sold product into the U.S. but didn't produce any of their own foam in the U.S. So we're looking at it, or North America. We're saying, how do we go about doing that? If you look at Carpenter's facilities, they're really geared toward high efficiency, large volumes, that type of stuff. And we had a very strong polyol relationship and a good industry friendship, which I would put an advocate out for people that are in this industry, make friends, right? Friends come to play in all kinds of things. So we were very good friends with the people at NCFI. They, at that time, were a single site flexible foam manufacturer and really thinking, what did they want to do with that? They were having good growth in their spray foam, geotechnical, other businesses, and really trying to say, is flexible foam for us or is it not? They had been involved in it since the 1960s, right? It's always hard in a legacy business what to do. And so I just kind of asked them, I said, well, would you be interested in selling that to us? And they were kind of like, aren't you a little busy with Recticel? And I said, yeah, but I think your business fits that plan for us. It's really like a custom shop for us. And so we were
Yeah.
kind of the NCFI fit is really as a custom colors, custom formulations, custom products opportunity for us. So, bringing stuff from instead of importing it from Europe, domesticating it, those kinds of things. And that's where those two pieces came together. Casper was a whole different thing in and of itself, but those two kind of dovetailed into each other pretty well
That
back
okay,
in
so
the
that
day.
really makes sense because it really is this geographic diversification and product diversification to strengthen your business.
Right.
What is the Casper story? So first of all, I just got to say, like, I'm a chemical engineer. I've been in the chemical industry for a long time. But as you and I both know, like you sit in certain parts of the industry and that's what you know. So it's rare to understand all the thousands of products that people produce and touch and what have you. You and I got to know each other really around the EO value chain and how it plays into surfactants. And then there's this whole polyurethanes piece, which, by the way, I still don't stinking understand, but I'm just going to accept it and go and know that I'm using this stuff every day. But I think of Carpenter as a chemical company. That's how I got to know you. And yet you've got this whole consumer business, which I guess is where Casper fits in.
Yeah, so it's interesting from the overall perspective, right? When I came to Carpenter, I really looked at it as there's a chemical business in here that a lot of people that existed within Carpenter didn't know a lot about and weren't familiar with. And I was a chemical guy, right? So I looked at that and said, here's an opportunity to grow a chemical business with a lot of good resources and assets that I don't know that they really, from that side, they didn't really understand the chemical side, right? So here I was this bridge to say, look, I've been 20 years in the chemical business. I understand it. Let's get the right team in place. Let's build something here. Let's give us the opportunity. And Mr. Pauly and the management at Carpenter at the time were fantastic because they were like, we'll let you do what you think is best on it, which is a freedom that you don't normally get. I mean, a lot of
Yeah,
times when
that's
you switch
amazing.
companies, you get promised a lot of things, but then to actually be given those things. And look, we like to say here, investment follows profits, right? So
Right.
if I had started the chemical business, asked for a bunch of money without having any growth, they would have been like, yeah, no, right? But we had growth, we had opportunities, we were able to grow the business on that side. And then gradually I learned more about I knew about the flexible foam business as a supplier of raw materials, but not really knew the business. So I was
Right.
fortunate that for that 10 years, I kind of was sitting in meetings and attending things and learning kind of on the periphery about the business and how it works and how it fits, right? And when you look at making a flexible foams, polyurethanes in general have been around for 90 years. So, I can talk long about the polyurethane space because I've been in it a long time, but it's a 90-year technology. I think the current estimate market size is it's around $100 billion market worldwide. So it's a
Wow.
pretty significant chemical business, right? And you got great companies in it like BASF and Covestro and Huntsman and Evonik and Momentive, right? I mean, there's lots of really good companies in that space, and some of them are broad and they cover other markets of the chemical industry, and some are more niche, right? And they specialize in those. But there's a lot of great chemistry going on. And in a flexible foam, about half of the foam itself that you're sitting on or sleeping on is polyol, right? So Carpenter 50 years ago, 53 years ago now, said, hey, we should make our own polyol, right? We should have some control over that because not only did it make economic sense, but it also made sense when you're trying to develop and innovate products. If you're always having to go to somebody else to say, can you do this for me? They have to decide if that's a good business decision for them or not. And a lot of the technology gets evolved from the additives and the polyols themselves, how long chain polyol you're making, how many branches in the chain. So we're able to kind of work with those tools to kind of tailor new products from the chemical business. So it's great to have that base load of business to run a chemical business off of where you have a significant amount of what you're doing is being consumed internally for what we're doing. And that parlays itself into a little bit of the discussion on Casper. And some people might be like, where's he going with all of this, right? So historically, prior to maybe 15 years ago, 12 years ago, something like that, the channels to market and the roles that people played were pretty straightforward, right? Carpenter made foam. If people came to us and they wanted to buy a block of foam, we sold it to them. If they wanted us to cut pieces and shapes, we did that for them. They would come to us sometimes and say, we want Carpenter to contract manufacture the whole mattress for us. and ship it to our warehouse or whatever. That was the role we played, and it was a great role that went in. But with kind of the bed in a box and some of the other disruptors that were going on, and with technology, the channels started getting muddied, right? And so you had
Yeah.
then different people going upstream and downstream. People that have kind of moved upstream are the Ashleys of the world. Tempur Sealy pours their own foam. So you have people now that are pouring their own foam. You have people that are doing various things in there. So it's not a clear A to B to C channel. And so you're like, okay, what roles is everybody playing in this? What roles will they play in the future? Casper was one of the original bed in a box people, so they were one of the original disruptors. A lot of people may not remember that they early on had investors like Leonardo DiCaprio and Ashton Kutcher and others. They were a hot star. I think at the time they called those companies unicorns, right? And they were a
Yeah.
unicorn. They had a lot of interest and a lot of buzz around it. And their message originally was, you don't need to go to a store to buy a mattress. You can just buy it online. We're cutting out the middleman. And that was effective marketing, and it grew significantly from. But what they realized is when you're making a big ticket purchase and a refrigerator, a mattress, a car, people like to touch and feel that product. And so there's a significant number of people that won't buy unless they can put their hands on it and actually see it for themselves. So Casper started launching stores to support that. They started working with other retailers to do what's called omni-channel, right? So that they could get the product in front of more people. And as they did that, they were raising money, and then they went public with that. And they poured a lot of money into making the brand successful. What I
Yeah.
would say they didn't do, and where the role Carpenter came in, is they didn't look after the making of the product really well. They made a great product. That's not, don't take that wrong and say this, but they weren't manufacturers. So they didn't really, they would farm out to different people, and they would go around quarter to quarter, and they would have different people making it for them. And you think, well, that's okay as long as people conform to the standards and the specifications. But if you're not really focused on logistics, if you're not really focused on the actual production, and you're not focused on what's your cost to deliver the product, things get out of hand. And so they came to us at the end of 2023, and they were like, we need help with the manufacturing side. And we looked at it and said, boy, we've got 11 locations around US and Canada that we can ship from. We may not ship from all of them, but just on a brief logistics, we were able to improve their cost structure with that. And I think if the market had been better, right, if the furniture demand and bedding demand had been better than it was the last 2 or 3 years, that
Yeah.
would have been sufficient for them, and they would have been able to let's say grow their way through this process. But as we all know, the market hasn't been what we'd want it to be. And so the combination of that plus some high kind of overhead costs related to leases of corporate headquarters and other things like that, they just struggled, and we looked at it and said, we think we can help them right the ship if we took it over. And really that was how we came about getting the Casper side of the business. And it's a learning curve, definitely. So
I bet. And in fact, I want to come around to that learning curve piece and how you're bringing this all together. But what's interesting is, number one, I did not remember that Casper was the original bed in a box, right? So I think of Casper and I see him at Costco, for instance. There are probably other places. I got to be honest, I don't get out much anymore. Not since COVID, not since I do everything out of my house. It's kind of crazy. But what's interesting about this story, and it's a story of a lot of innovative companies throughout probably the late 2010s, so probably in the same time frame that Casper started up, let's say 2018 till now, and is that it was this idea that a business, a $1 billion business, could be grown on the strength of the brand and the strength of marketing, and that all of the production could be contracted out. So that it sounds like that was at least part of the Casper story. I'm thinking about Kylie Jenner, which we don't normally talk about Kylie Jenner on the show, but she had her lip thing, and I have daughters, so they were all obsessed about the lip thing. But I still remember Kylie Jenner had like $1 billion business valuation and didn't own a thing, because it was all contract labs, contract manufacturing, et cetera. Now, where it is today, who the heck knows? I don't know. But I think it's an interesting just kind of sign of the times and the evolution that we've gone through in business is this idea that, yeah, you can start small and nimble and outsourcing things, but eventually, as people across the industry know, you have to get your cost under control. You actually have to get your supply chain under control, your logistics, manufacturing, et cetera. So that's a really interesting story. But with this, so this is my part. I'm turning it back. Is Carpenter's really? I'm a 75-year-old company, strong culture. What I would say is a very traditional culture in a lot of ways. And you've brought 3 businesses into the fold in the last several years. That is a lot of change. So, how are you guys navigating it, both in terms of figuring out how to bring those teams into Carpenter, but also Carpenter growing and embracing the best of what those companies bring?
It's a fantastic question, and I hope that if we get together this 5 years from now, you'd say, "Wow, that look at how that all has come together as perfectly." Right? It's early on you were talking about, hey, it's a crazy time, but thinking back on it, I think crazy is more the normal, right? The chaos kind of thing. We can talk about 2008 into 2009 with the subprime mortgage situation. I'm sure in 15 or 16 I can find a hurricane that screwed things up, right? And
Oh,
then you
yeah.
had COVID, post-COVID. So I'm not sure that normal, we like to, as humans, we probably like to think normal is the normal state of things, but probably chaos is more the normal and calm is probably the exception. And it's probably disheartening for lots of people to hear, but you just look back on it and you kind of have to be, I guess, adaptive and flexible in that
Yeah.
regard. And that's somewhat the approach that we've taken a little bit with the acquisitions, right? When you're picking up a Recticel, and as I mentioned, Recticel had just recently acquired a company called Foam Partner, right, which was a distinct, different entity and people. And Foam Partner, 3 years before that, 3 or 4, had acquired a small systems house called Autobach, right? So you have these 3 different cultures rolling up into a company that then you pick up, right? So you really have 4 cultures. And what you find is some people gravitate to the carpenter culture really easy, right? They
Yeah.
get there, they go, wow, I get it, I understand it, I fit right in, away we go. And then you have a group of people that are, I get it or I understand it, but it's going to take me a while to get it. You have some people that have, good people, good managers who look at it and say, this just is not for me, right? This is not. And sometimes those people hang on and they try to make it work and we try to make it work and ultimately they get frustrated, we get frustrated and they leave, right? And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
we didn't take the approach like in the beginning we're going to do this. We're going to move headcount from here to here. We're going to consolidate. We're going to do that stuff. We said let's sit with the organization. Let's understand it. Let's understand the people. A good example that I would give is if you have a small manufacturing plant and you go to them and you say you're the division manager of that plant. You say who are your best people? They give you their 5 best people. You go to the next plant in maybe you go from Norway to Finland and you ask them for their 5 best people. They may not be the same roles at one job to the other. So if you said we're going to eliminate this, somebody's going to say I'm fine with that because that person wasn't that great anyway. The next person's going to have a complete freak out and
Yeah.
say you're taking away my best person, right? So I think as much as the maybe that's not the textbook way of doing it, you'd say, hey, let's get to lean right away. Let's do these kinds of things. You end up throwing out people who can make significant changes to your company and your culture and significant improvements, and it takes a little bit to figure out who those people are, right? And so we've kind of taken that approach. It's been a little bit challenging, right? Because if the economy was booming, you'd be like, hey, this is great, but you always look back and say, are you moving fast enough? Are you too slow? Are you too fast? When people say, what are the things that keep you awake at night? Some of that is for me where it's like, are we going fast enough? Are we going too fast? Where is the right pace of change? Because again, you mentioned 3 acquisitions is a lot, even for legacy carpenter people, which is not the way we've done it to take on. So you're always
Right.
mindful. And I'm a real people first person. I mean, people would get to know me, would see that and say, probably first and foremost, I'm thinking get the right people in the right chairs make them feel like they're part of that process, and then the results will follow, right? And so I'm really sensitive, like, how fast are we moving or not fast enough, and some of those kinds of things. So
Yeah. Well, and I think you also, I would absolutely recognize, I think you're definitely people first, and your people would say that as well. The people I know that you work with, that work with you. I think that's just a great thing, because I think sometimes, especially, if you look at private equity across the industry is taking a bigger role, you could, I think it's always been, right? So again, back to this whole, there's always this evolution. It's often about just sheer dollars as opposed to the longevity of the business. And that's one of the opportunities I guess you guys as Carpenter have, given that you're a private company, you have a bit more leeway in terms of reaching those goals, that you're not trying to hit an artificial quarterly target that your stockholders are looking for. And I know that your shareholders are looking for profitability and longevity and all that, right? They're all, every owner is doing that, but that you have a bit more leeway to create that plan, to grow to that vision, and make things happen.
yeah, well, a friend of mine that I got to work with on the Recticel deal, I didn't know him before, I became a good friend. He gave me this phrase that I like a lot, and it kind of resonates well within how we look at Carpenter, which he said, sales is vanity, profit is sanity, but cash is reality, right? And so we are very focused on, is what we're doing building cash, or is it taking away from cash?
Yeah.
And that's not just all right, we're just looking at the windshield all the time. We're looking down the road. We've invested in simple things like you'd say, well, we'll put a betting line in X location. A lot of times that is $1 million plus investment. And you say, okay, let's think about that. And then you look at maybe a return on investment and say, okay, that's a 3 to 5 year payback. Sometimes that's right within that payback. And sometimes you get a win where it pays back in a year and a half or 2 years, right? And the chemical side, those investments go up exponentially, right? Investments aren't 5 to $10 million. They're 30 to 50 to 100 million. And sometimes if you're a really big boy like a Lyondell or a BSF or somebody, they're billions of dollars, right? And significant stuff. And so you have to really say, okay, is this the right thing to do 10 years from now or 15 years from now? I think Peter Huntsman was alluding to that on one of your earlier discussions with him, right? You have to be looking down the road and saying, I think that this is the right geography, the right market. Getting it back to the Recticel side or the European side, I had somebody, I don't know, it was probably now 2 years ago, said, it's interesting, you're one of the few companies investing in Europe.
Yeah, I
And
was
I
going to
said,
ask
look,
about that. Yeah.
I said, look, we go to where the consumers are, right? Our best customers are people in the middle to upper middle class, people who want to have a high quality sofa. Everybody wants to have a high quality bed and sofa, but not everybody can afford those kinds of things. And so when we look at it, and I fundamentally come back to it saying the European consumer has money. They, even after you get through all this, they will still have money. They may be less well off down the next 15 or 20 years, but they've still got money to spend. It's incumbent on us and our customers to find reasons for that consumer to say, I want to buy what they're offering. And we think local production, our stuff, we talked about exporting stuff from Europe to the US. That's not a long-term play for us. Our job is to export stuff, is to make stuff, in the region for the region, right? We're making in
Yeah.
North America for North America. If we're making something in India or China, we're making it for that market. It's not to export it somewhere else. And so we're really focused on what are the consumers and what are the companies in that region. And so that's the reason why when people ask, hey, you're big in Europe, do you plan to stay that way? I look at it and say, yes. Getting into the European side, right? So you look at that and you say, all right, I'm like Peter Huntsman with this regard. I'm a big advocate of the chemical industry in Europe, right? I think the chemical industry in Europe needs to survive and needs to thrive because of two things. One, I need the chemicals, so selfishly I want them to do it. But the more manufacturing jobs they have, call me old fashioned, the better off their consumers are and the more able their consumers are to spend the money, right? And if
Yeah.
you just outsource all of that, then at what point is it not a sustainable loop? So
Yeah, I'm with you on that. In fact, that's one of the biggest things I see as I keep seeing announcement after announcement of shutdown of assets in Europe is it's a lot of job loss. Like,
Right.
what are those people going to do? Because I do think that manufacturing roles are critical, and we know that manufacturing actually enhances communities, right? So ACC has done some work that says that for every one job at a chemical plant, there's 5 to 6 jobs in the surrounding community, whether it be schools or taxi drivers or whatever, all the things, restaurants. And so I think about that aspect of if we start pulling production away from regions, number one, it at the end of the day, and you know, if you think about from a sustainability perspective as well, transportation is not our most sustainable activity. Sorry to all the transportation people, but you know, buying local inherently has some sustainability benefits, but also this aspect of continuing to develop people, communities, the financials in those communities, et cetera, is really, really critical.
Yeah, I mean, at Carpenter, we make stuff, right? And I'm
Yeah.
proud of the fact that we make stuff, and I'm happy when young people, engineers or whatever, want to get involved in manufacturing, right? Because I think making stuff is a great way. It's been a great career for me, and we have
Yeah.
roughly 7,000 employees now worldwide, and some of those obviously with Casper in the retail side, but fully 90% plus are in the manufacturing process in some form or fashion, right? They're at the plant, they're helping to move the product to the customers, whatever it is, right? And those jobs are important to everybody. They're important to the people's families. They're important to the communities and they're involved in. One of the great things I like as a private company that always brings a smile to my face is people will come to us and they've retired or they've been out in the community for a while and they'll say, I spent my whole career at Carpenter, and because of your profit sharing plan, I have a really great retirement, right? And so
Yeah.
Mr. Carpenter, back in the day, the story goes that he was visiting a plant in North Carolina and saw an old gentleman working on the production line, went over and started talking to him and said, and the guy basically alluded is, I can't afford to retire. And so on the trip back, he said, I don't want anybody to work at Carpenter because they have to. I want them to work here because they want to. So they started a profit sharing plan, right? And so we have a 401k, but we have a profit sharing plan. And it's really great to see people who've worked 30 years with the company say, I can afford a nice retirement because of the profit sharing plan.
That's
Sometimes
really nice.
people borrow against their 401k or they make bad long-term decisions for the short term. But if you have a profit sharing plan, you can look back and say, we're trying to do the right things for somebody who says, I want to make a career out of working here. And to
Yeah.
me, there's no better. I'm probably smiling a lot right now as we're talking about it because to me, that's making a difference in people's lives. And so we really, at Carpenter, we say our purpose is to enhance the quality of people's lives. And a lot of times people draw an immediate connection to a furniture or a mattress, right? Oh, well, I get it. That's an easy connection. But people aren't just the customers, they're our employees as well, right? So we want to enhance the quality of their lives through what we're doing. We want their jobs to have purpose and meaning. And one of the earlier podcasts that you had was on AI, right? And so that's a big question, right? Is what is AI going to play the role if it can do everything for the basic level stuff? How does a young person coming into the industry get trained then, right? And maybe I'm missing the boat. Maybe it's a different way of working 5 years from now, and we say that's okay that they don't have to have the basic blocking and tackling that you
Yeah.
or I had in the industry. I don't know the answer to that, but it is a question of like how does a lawyer become a seasoned lawyer if they don't do the junior lawyer stuff, right? And so for us, it's the same kind of thing. We want to use AI to free people up. We want to take away the 20% of their job that is rote and doesn't have high value so that they can get more value out of their job. That's how we're looking at the AI side. I don't
Yeah.
think we have any answers on it, but it's very much okay. Somebody gets rid of the 20% they were doing, that frees up their capacity to do more value added, right? That's our approach to AI. We're not anywhere we need to be yet on it, but we think that that's kind of the right path to think of AI. So
I think that's right. I think this whole idea of I don't think AI replaces relationships. It doesn't replace critical thinking,
mhm.
but maybe it replaces the basic stuff. I mean, if you think about it, back in the day, people used to take letters from point to point via the Pony Express. Well, we now can text people. we still need to communicate, right? So
Right.
it's changed. It's faster. It's actually created so much more communication. I mean, we started out talking earlier, maybe before we got on the thing about, kids in college and what have you. And I used to go walk down the hall to the payphone to call my parents when was in college. My kids are sending me multiple text messages, calling me, doing whatever. Communication has amplified, not gotten less through the use of
Yeah, and
technology.
the expectations have changed a lot too. You
Yeah.
talk about the phone, right? Your parents were probably thankful to get a call on Sunday night once a week, right?
Right.
Now if you don't respond to your wife's text or your kid's text within 5 minutes, they're pointing fingers referring to the thing they sent you 5 minutes ago, and you're like, look, I'm in the middle of something, right? But
Yeah.
I remember as a young sales guy, right? You would go to the payphone to get your messages, right? It sounds like I'm from the 1930s, right? And we lived in black and white, but you did that stuff. But when email came along, you sent an email to somebody, and the expectations around email was you gave the person the information, and when they had their answer ready, they would get back to you, right?
Right.
That's completely foreign now. The idea that you send an email to somebody in the next 2 or 3 days they would get back to you, there's a lot of people that would be like, that is not how email works today, right? And
I know.
the
It's a little
expectations
crazy,
and
in
everything
fact.
else, right? Yeah. And
Yeah.
it's just different, and I think AI will make things different in the future, and we'll look back on it and
Yeah.
say, that was pretty crazy that we used to do this.
Yeah, what are you guys doing digitally? I know you've talked about AI, and I think about, again, I go back to thinking about Carpenter as being, in a lot of ways, an old school company, and yet I know that you've used a lot of digital across your businesses. So, what are you guys doing, and where are your priorities when we think about digital and AI?
So I kind of set a broad like strategy, you want to call it that way, but the phrase I use internally is we want to get the right information to the right people at the right time, right? And I think those three things are important, right? You
Yeah.
said there's a lot of information, right? There's a lot of bad information, there's a lot of not useful information, and how do people sort through that? You and I have been in the industry for a long time, so we're using our judgment to decide that this piece of information is good or bad. Somebody who's just coming into the industry doesn't have that kind of experience. So how do they know the information that's coming to them is useful or not useful? I can use the laboratory side, right? So they get some information maybe out of AI that says, this is how you should create a starter formulation. They have no judgment to know whether that's a good starting point or a bad starting point. Or a 15-year chemist looks at it and says, you know what? We went down that road. We tried it. It didn't quite work. Start at this point, not at that point, right? And
Yeah.
and so right information is important to the right people, right? So a salesperson needs information, and that's what they are, is they're purveyors of information to the customer and back, and they're helping facilitate, right? They're the point
Yeah.
guard of what's going on. So the point guard needs to know what play the coach wants to run. He needs to get the players in the right spot, and he needs to deliver the pass to them at the right time, right? It doesn't do you any good to throw a pass when a guy's being guarded. He's got to get open, right? And so right time, right place, right information, all that is the broad category. And then the how to make it happen is where the real difficulty comes in. It's
Yeah.
easy as a CEO to say, here's the broad vision, right? Just right people, right place, right information, right time, that sounds easy. And then you say, what softwares do I need to put in to do that? And we got various teams. We got 30, I think it's 32, but over 30 places that pour foam, right? And they pour
Mm.
it on a continuous basis around the world. And they're generating data and information off of how that production is going every day. How do you take all those trillions of bytes of information, put them into a useful thing so that what we learned in Finland somehow makes its way to California. And so when the guy in California is going to do this, he gets information and the system helps him reduce waste, right?
Yeah.
And how do we do that? And we have customers that require perfect cell structure, let's say. So foam cellular material,
Sure.
they have specifications that it can only be between 1 and 5 microns. And so you're trying to pour foam that's exactly perfect all the time. And you need information and AI to do that. And you have other customers that's the antithesis. If you pour it too uniform, it creates a problem, right? So you're trying to meet those needs in varying categories for what the customer wants. I mean,
Yeah.
ultimately, what we serve the customer is we got to create products that the customer believes that they have to have because that makes their product better, different, that they can succeed with. And so we need to understand what their requirements are and how do we exceed their expectations and do it obviously in a way that we can be profitable and they can be profitable and everything else. But
Yeah.
that's where that type of information is really hard to kind of coalesce and get around. But that's what we're working towards in that regard is supporting those kinds of things. So,
That's awesome. We are running. I think we're running out of time, but I'm going to give you one
yeah.
final question, and then we're going to wrap this. And as you know, I know you listen loyally to the podcast, and hopefully you listen all the way through. So my final question is, let's talk about leadership. What's one piece of leadership advice, career leadership advice that you would offer to someone early in their career that perhaps started in sales and looked around and not knowing what else they were doing, that maybe ultimately leads to them being a CEO or to them just being super successful in their career? What advice do you offer?
Yeah, I actually have two pieces of advice if I can double dip on it.
Yeah,
The first piece
absolutely.
of advice I give to people is nobody wants to give you your next job unless you're doing well in your current job. And a lot of times people lose track and they think about the next thing and they drop the ball on the current thing. If you're doing a really good job in what you're doing, if you're the best in what you're doing or one of the top people, people look
Yeah.
around and they value that and they say, I think that person's capable of doing more. But if you're not doing a very good job and you raise your hand and you say, I want to do something more, they're like, she's not even handling what they got. Why would I give them more? And
Right.
so my message is be really good in what you're doing and you'll get recognized. And if you don't get recognized in your current company, shame on them. You'll get recognized by somebody else in the industry who looks at that person and says, that, I'll use an old man phrase, that kid's a winner, right? We want winners on our
Yeah.
team. Let's get them, right? And I think the other one is, and is someone put it this way. I think it was in actually Ted Lasso of all things said to be curious, right? So a lot of people think that the learning stops when they get the degree, and that yeah, you move along at a slower pace. You kind of learn your job, but in for me to become the CEO, not only did I have to do a good job running the chemical business, right? And I had to be recognized for that, but I had to be somebody that asked questions and started to understand about the other businesses because I don't think Mr. Pauly would have looked at it and said, "Yeah, he's a chemical industry expert, but how do I project him being an expert of all these other things that you have to know?" But it was because I was involved and I was curious and I learned and asked questions and they could kind of see, well, he's got an interest in things that are beyond just the chemical
Yeah.
guy, right? So they looked at it and said, he's curious, he's capable, right? He's doing a good job. Let's give him an opportunity. Now that was a big opportunity, right? And it's hard. People say, hey, is there's a fair bit of luck or destiny or whatever you want to call it in that way, that type of thing that happens to it. There's,
Being in the
Lyondell
right
had
place
some,
at the right time. There's a
yeah,
lot
well,
to be
yeah,
said for that. Yeah.
Lyondell, BSF, others, they have turnover. They have great people. You're like, why did somebody get that CEO job and somebody not? There's lots of factors that go into that are beyond just the two things I was giving somebody. So
Yeah.
there is a bit of that, whatever luck element or how people want to look at those things that's out of your control. But you can only control the two things I'm giving you. You can control how good you're doing at your job, and you control how much curiosity you have. And if you put those things in control, then the other stuff you can't really worry about. So
Love it. Love it. That is great advice. Brad, thank you. Thanks for sharing everything. As always, a great conversation with you. Appreciate it.
thank you for the time, and I'm sorry I didn't have some really big announcement for you, on
Well,
this.
I was going to ask you about your new tagline that you kind of, we make stuff. So
Yeah.
is that the new, the new
No, it's not the new
announcement? But I won't put
tagline.
that on you.
Yeah. Yeah, and people often ask on the acquisition side, right? And we always remain curious, right, on
Yeah.
things. And are there opportunities for us to partner with people, to work, fundamentally we want to grow our business, and so we're open to all avenues of that. But there's nothing
Perfect.
today that I can come on and give you an exclusive about something.
That's all right.
But
I would not expect it.
I'll let you know if there is. So,
Okay. Cool. I love it. Love it. Well, Brant, thank you so much.
thanks for the time as always, and I look forward to hearing this one and all the future ones that you put out as well. So
Thanks, absolutely. And thanks everyone for listening. Keep listening, keep following, keep sharing, and we will talk with you soon. Thanks for joining us today on The Chemical Show. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and most importantly, share it with your friends and colleagues. For more insights, visit thechemicalshow.com and connect with us on LinkedIn. You can find me at Victoria King Meyer on LinkedIn, and you can also find us at The Chemical Show Podcast. Join us next time for more conversations and strategies shaping the future of the industry. We'll see you soon.